All right, Sarah, can you see us on the Conservancy page?
Yes, we're live. You're good.
Fantastic. All right, everybody, thank you so much for being patient. Welcome. I'm going to share a screen with you here so that you can see our welcome slides, and we will get started. My name is Susan Bowden, and I am the Digital Outreach Coordinator for the Archaeological Conservancy, and I want to welcome you tonight to our presentation. This is our 2023 virtual lecture series, Prospect Hill, Enslavement and Freedom from Mississippi to Africa. I am really excited to bring to you three amazing, wonderful speakers tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to them very shortly. But first, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, we have a Q&A section. If you look down toward the bottom of your screen, you'll see it. That's probably the best place to put questions. You could put them in the chat, but the chat tends to move rather quickly, and I don't want your question to get lost. We will have question time toward the end of the presentation, and if we run out of time, we'll gather up your questions and I'll get answers for you and then send them via email. If you have technical difficulties, you're probably going to all chuckle with this one. Head on over to our Facebook feed. It's now displaying correctly over there. And then finally, I will be processing a recorded version of the presentation. It should be up on our YouTube channel sometime in the middle of the day tomorrow. Feel free to rewatch or to share it with friends if you would like to. So with no further ado, I want to get started in introducing to you our three presenters, and I'm going to go off share screen so that you can see them better. So we have, first of all, Jessica Fleming Crawford. She is our Southwest Regional Director for the Conservancy.
Southeast.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
so used to saying Southwest, Jessica, I apologize.
Okay.
Southeast Regional Director for the Conservancy. Her office is in Marks, Mississippi, and she is responsible for managing Conservancy properties in 8 southeastern states. So she's a busy lady. She has a lot of different responsibilities. I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about some of what she does as she opens the presentation. She attended the University of Mississippi, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in English and then a master's in anthropology with an emphasis in archaeology. After Jessica, we're going to hear from Dr. James Andrew Whitaker, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Troy University, and he serves as adjunct faculty at Mississippi State and as an honorary research fellow at the University of St. Andrews. He's going to talk about the sociocultural anthropology angle of the presentation tonight. And then after that, you're going to hear from Dr. Shawn Lambert, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at Mississippi State University, who specializes in Southeastern archaeology. Specifically, he studies late pre-European contact and historic periods with an emphasis in remote sensing technologies, ceramic analysis, and public archaeology. So these guys are all very busy, interesting folks. I am really thankful that you're all here tonight. Thank you for joining us. Nikki and Sarah are going to be my pinch hitters in helping out on the back end. So again, remember that you've got a place to put questions. Jessica, I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you, Susan. And real quick, I want to point out that Nikki Matson is also my pinch hitter as well here in the Southeast Regional Office. She works here in Marks with me and is also, of course, very familiar with Prospect Hill Plantation. It's been a conservancy preserve since, I believe, 2010. And it's kind of unique for my region. Most of the sites in the Southeast are pre-contact Native American sites, mound sites. We do have a few colonial sites. We have some Civil War sites. But this is the only quote unquote plantation site we have. And of course, so this is historic archaeology. And this was really a new and interesting project for me when I first started it several years ago. Go ahead to the next slide. Shawn is going to do our slide presentation for us. So, yeah, okay, there you go. All right, and this is just to kind of give you an idea of where in Mississippi Prospect Hill is located. It's kind of down in the southwestern portion of Mississippi. It's not too far east of the Mississippi River, and this is certainly, it's not what we think of as plantation or agricultural areas of the area of Mississippi now, but back in the late 1700s, entire 1800s, this was plantation country. It's a little bit north of the city of Natchez, which is on the Mississippi River. And this is the area where enslaved Africans were first brought into the region by the French in the early 1700s. By the eve of the Civil War, Natchez, Mississippi had more millionaires than any city in the country. And they also had one of the largest, most notorious slave markets called Forks of the Road slave market. And actually, just a little side note, the Conservancy recently helped the National Park Service acquire a tract of this really important slave market. I guess last year they closed on that. So we've had a role in a lot of these events and in commemorating a lot of this history in the area. So at the time when Prospect Hill was established, it was in the heart of Mississippi's plantation country. Next slide. Right now, I'm going to try not to get too deep into the genealogy. This could get confusing, but there are just a few main characters that you need to know to understand the history and the events of the plantation. Prospect Hill was established by a Revolutionary War veteran named Captain Isaac Ross. He moved to Mississippi in the early 1800s. The first time he shows up in the census is 1808, and he had, according to the census, 60 enslaved people. He brought his 5 adult children, and their spouses came with them as well, and he maintained close ties with South Carolina. He also had a brother who read to Mississippi. So Isaac Ross named the plantation Prospect Hill because he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He named it for I believe that the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Prospect Hill. So we believe that's where the name for the plantation came from. Let's see, he was an interesting fellow. He had the only children that survived. Well, all of his children survived to adulthood, but his 2 sons and 2 daughters died. Unfortunately, they weren't able to help him with his plans for his will, but he did have a daughter named Jane Ross Wade, and I'm trying to keep this short and simple. She had 2 sons. She had other sons too, but the 2 we need to be concerned with are Walter Wade and Isaac Ross Wade. And so these are the grandsons of Captain Isaac Ross. And we don't have a picture of what Walter Wade looked like, so I've got a picture of his house here on the family tree. His house is called Rosswood, and it's located probably about 15 miles from where Prospect Hill was located and is located. Isaac Ross Wade was married to, his wife's name was Catherine Dunbar Wade. And so these are just the names that you'll need to know in just a minute when I explain what happened. You can go to the next slide. All right, well, Captain Isaac Ross was a member of the Mississippi chapter of the American Colonization Society. And I'm going to let Andrew tell you most about what the American Colonization Society was. But basically, it was established by abolitionists, by planters, by a lot of different people in both the North and the South. And it was really sort of based on the idea that enslaved people could be resettled in Liberia, in the country that we know as Liberia now. Individual states had chapters, like there was a Mississippi in Africa, there was a Louisiana, there was a Maryland, there was a Virginia. And Isaac Ross was one of the large planters in Mississippi who helped establish the Mississippi chapter of the Colonization Society. So he was, and this was something that usually just very extremely wealthy planters were a part of, and they were part of this organization for, different reasons. Some may have thought that slavery was wrong, it wasn't going to end, it was not going to last. They wanted a place to actually free their enslaved people. And, in the 1800s, the early 1800s in Mississippi, it was illegal to free a large group of enslaved people. I mean, you couldn't do it. If somebody were going to be a free Black in Mississippi, they had to have permission from the legislature to be freed, and they better not be caught without their papers proving that they had permission. So this was a way for planters and just anyone who wanted to free enslaved people to send them somewhere else. Of course, it was also sort of a racist thinking where, they also didn't like the idea of free Black people around, that puts ideas into the enslaved population. So, but Isaac Ross was a member of this society. Next slide. I'm trying to go kind of fast so we don't get tied up in all this genealogy stuff. He died in 1836, and by the time he died, he owned about 4,000 acres, and according to his inventory, he owned 163 enslaved people. This on this slide is just kind of the last portion of his inventory that was done after his death. To kind of give you an idea, you can see the lot with names, ages, and values on them, and the last two lots of enslaved people. And then it lists hogs, how many hogs he had, how many sheep, just so it's sort of, you get the idea that obviously these were not so much people as they were possessions, which had, they had monetary value in the eyes of people at the time. And he was a very large planter. I believe the plantation was close to 4,000 acres. Next slide. Now, he had an interesting will, and remember this grandson, Isaac Ross Wade, was made one of his executors of this will, along with, like, I think he was one of 5 executors. And Isaac Ross, his will said that after his death, after the harvest of the next cotton crop, that the entire plantation was, well, first, all the enslaved people were to be gathered and to be told that they had a choice. They could choose to stay in America and they would be sold in family groups at an auction, or they could choose to go to the Mississippi colony in Africa, which was established by the Mississippi chapter of the American Colonization Society. And it was up to them. And if there was a cotton crop in the field at that time, at the time of his death, the harvest would go on and go through. And then after that harvest, the plantation was to be sold, as well as the crop and, all of the equipment, everything was to be sold. And the proceeds from that sale were to be used to send those who chose to go to the colony in Liberia to Africa. And of course, that's the Colonization Society would assist with that. And it did cost money. You had to get a boat to take them over there. His will also said that those proceeds were to be used to buy them seed, buy them farming implements, and to establish a school for them. So, they weren't just supposed to be just dropped out on the shores of Liberia. They were supposed to be supplied with what they needed to begin new lives there as free people. And so this was in 1836 when Captain Ross passed away, and his grandson and 4 other people were executors. Well, of course, the grandson was not pleased with that. He wanted to inherit the estate. He felt like he was justified in inheriting the estate, even though he sat there and witnessed his grandfather, making out his will. And so he decided to take it to court. Next slide. And this says there's a pamphlet called A Brief History of the Ross Slaves. Well, it was not brief. Actually, a court fight ensued, led by the grandson who had been the executor of the will, and he sued to have the will dissolved, and so he could inherit the plantation. And what he did, because he was an executor, he did move into the house there at Prospect Hill. While he was there living in the house and running the plantation for the estate, he was also busy fighting the estate, fighting the will, trying to overturn the will. And he would lose a judgment, then he would try again, he would go to another court. Captain Ross had a lot of important and wealthy friends who defended his will and wanted to see his wishes carried out. And they were also fellow members of the Colonization Society. And so the court case dragged on. And after about 9 years, next slide, while this court case was still going on, and of course, the enslaved people were certainly aware, the enslaved people at Prospect Hill, those 163, knew what the will had said. They were certainly aware that they were supposed to be given the choice to go to the colony and Africa, and that this grandson, who was there in the big house now and running the plantation, was fighting it. And so there was a lot of tension, of course, between Isaac Ross Wade and the people who he was forcing to farm there and to continue to hold in bondage, even though they knew that their freedom had been willed to them. So there's a lot of tension there. And after about 9 years in the middle of this, or while this court case was going on, there was a fire at Prospect Hill. There was a lot of the family were getting together one night and for a celebration. And in the middle of the night, the brother of Isaac Ross Wade, the one who had the house, Rosswood, he was there also, and he was spending the night at the house. And he described, waking up in the middle of the night, he felt hot. He went over to a window, opened the window, and saw what he thought at first was mist coming up from the ground. He put his hands on the windowsill, and the windowsill was hot, and he realized the house was on fire. And so most of the family got out except for one little girl. She was she would have been the great granddaughter of Captain Ross. Isaac Ross Wade's sister and her children were staying there that night. So an 8-year-old girl named Martha Richardson was killed in the fire. Everyone else made it out, and the house burned to the ground. That's her gravestone. That's her headstone there in the bottom left of that slide there. She's buried behind the house in the family cemetery. Walter Wade, the brother of Isaac Ross Wade, later wrote about what happened in his diary and also described what happened in a letter to his wife. He mentions that, let's see, it's hard for me to see. Okay, yeah, let me get my glasses on. Of course, you can read it. Also, after the fire, he wrote, a week after the overseer detected a boy carrying provisions to a runaway belonging to the place, and from him found out that the house was set on fire by Esau, Andrew, and I put in those parentheses are mine, the runaway, and that it was the intention to burn up all in it or otherwise destroy them, and further developments have shown half the Negroes on the place as knowing to it. The only way to be sent off, meaning the only way to get to Liberia, was to burn up Mass Isaac, and then Mr. John Chambliss, he was designated a receiver of the Colonization Society, would get them and send them to Liberia. A crowd was collected, Negroes examined, and it was determined to send several to jail for safekeeping. But on the following night, Esau, Old Yeary, was stolen out from where they were confined and carried to a weather house, which is just a sort of a lean-to shelter in a field. There fastened and fire put to the house. Esau made further confessions of their plans and plots, but it did not arrest the fire. The next day, a crowd took out another boy and hung him. And in his will, you can see the entry on the bottom where he notes that Prospect Hill burned down the 14th, and then a few days later, Esau and Old Yeary were burned as incendiaries, and Gilbert was hung as conspirator. May 12th, the incendiary Andrew was caught and hung or burned. And there's a copy of the reward for Andrew. It took a few days for them to find Andrew in the woods there, and Isaac Ross Wade actually put a reward ad for him in the local newspaper, and saying that he had committed murder even before he burned the house down, and he had run away. And what I believe is that he was living in the woods. His father and other relatives were taking him food, and that's who was caught taking food to Andrew. And so we know at least these people were unjustly, there's no trial. The fire was certainly blamed on them. We may never know if they actually set the fire. I tend to believe that they probably did. It was certainly it was an act of resistance, and they knew what was going on. And it's not a fun story to tell, or to have to tell visitors to Prospect Hill, but we certainly owe it to the people who were involved to continue to tell the story. And so the house burned to the ground, and there were the deaths of these enslaved people. And next slide. And this was in 1845, 9 years after Isaac Ross died. And by 1847, the following year, the will was upheld by the Mississippi State Supreme Court. And there's a lot of, this was sort of a landmark decision for Mississippi legal history. There's several books and pamphlets about it. The will was upheld by the Mississippi State Supreme Court on the grounds that a man can will his property as he sees fit. It wasn't upheld on the fact that these people deserved their freedom. It was they were Isaac Ross's possessions, and he can will them as he sees fit. His grandson challenged it, just by saying you just can't free enslaved people, not like that. So the will was upheld, and a large group of people did make it to Liberia. People from Prospect Hill, a lot of their descendants actually became important leaders in Liberia. Unfortunately, some of them, there was a cholera outbreak while they were waiting on boats in New Orleans. Some of them, got that far, and then they died of cholera in New Orleans while they were waiting for passage to Liberia. But some actually did make it. Next slide. And so the grandson, Isaac Ross Way, did end up with the land that the first house had been built on, and the family cemetery, which is behind it. And he built another house on that spot in 1854. And that's the house that is there now. These are the earliest pictures we have of it. These are from the 1940s, and not much work was done on it since these pictures were taken. Really, it has not been, there's not been a lot of maintenance or updating done on Prospect Hill. The next slide. This is sort of a sketch. It is a one-story house. It's got a porch across the front. It does have 3 lower rooms. It's kind of they're basement rooms. They're connected to the house not by an indoor stairway. It's an outdoor stairway, but there are 3 rooms beneath the house and a large attic with a sort of a widow's walk on top of it. On the right is the WPA sketch that was done in the, I believe it was 1930s or 40s. And at the time, we know from an account of someone who was raised in the house, she was born in the house the day it was finished, actually. She described 2 brick outbuildings directly behind it. One was a kitchen and the other was a weaving room and a laundry. Yeah, and so by the time this WPA sketch was done, only one of the outbuildings was left behind the house. And that's the one I think that says kitchen and laundry. And then you can see it says front porch across the front. Nothing is still standing behind it now. There's a lot of brick foundations and cisterns and things like that. Okay, next slide. So I first found out about Prospect Hill. I read a book called Mississippi and Africa, the saga of the slaves of Prospect Hill Plantation and their legacy in Liberia today, by Alan Huffman, who's a well-known Mississippi author. Actually gave the book to my dad for Father's Day, and we both thought it was a fascinating history. We had no idea that Mississippi had these ties to Liberia, and I just kind of stuck it in the back of my mind. And then several years later, when I was working for the Conservancy and we were kind of assessing our sites, what we try to do is we'd like to get a representative sample of all time periods. And, we were looking at what we had sites representing and what we didn't. I thought, well, I don't have any. Our Eastern region has historic plantation sites, and there's a lot of historic archaeology, important plantation archaeology going on the East Coast. I have a lot of colleagues who are doing that. And I thought, well, I've just found myself out. I was visiting Prospect Hill, I was in the area and just curious and not thinking about it as a Conservancy acquisition until it occurred to me. We started reviewing our sites. I thought, well, we don't actually have a site that's a plantation archaeology. There was the issue, the fact that there was a large historic house there that's not in great shape. But the Conservancy, I was able to convince the Conservancy that this was an important place to get it. Well, we were able to buy it. We have about a little over 24 acres there. There's little work has been done in the yard. We don't have standing outhouses, outbuildings, but we do have a lot of undisturbed archaeology out there. And in the bottom part of the slide these are just little artifacts that we just picked up on the hill behind the house. And there's a picture of some of the bricks and things like that. And the connection to Liberia made it even more interesting. After reading Mississippi and Africa, the author Alan Huffman actually went to Liberia and found descendants of the people who were at Prospect Hill. So it's, it's really a unique plantation site. And no plantation in Mississippi has been preserved strictly for the archaeology. And this is an area that relies heavily on tourism of plantations. So the next slide. And this is just a copy of our survey. You can see that little funny shape in the middle is where the house and the cemetery are. That's the first purchase that we made, just 3.3 acres. And then we got another 20 acres. And of course, that's, the whole plantation when Isaac Ross died was almost 4,000 acres. So we we have a lot more to acquire, which I don't think we'll ever get quite that much. Next slide. And so what we did, the first few years that we had the place, really we had to reclaim it from the woods. It was not in great shape, as you can tell from that picture. We've never intended to make it into this beautiful plantation house, a showpiece or anything like that. For a long time, we thought maybe we could find someone to purchase it from us and we would retain a preservation easement on it. And, someone else could restore it and live in it and use it, and we could just protect the archaeology. And the historic preservation easement or the archaeological preservation easement would allow us to do some research there, within reason. And after, we have to coordinate with the owners, of course, but we did not intend to initially to keep it. But we did need to put a new roof on it. We've always felt that as long as the house is there, it's a place for people to come and a place that can host public outreach. And, if the house is not there, we still have the archaeology, but the house it's important, I think, to have the house there. It certainly is a place. It's a gathering place now, and that's how we've used it. We did raise $114,000 just for a roof, just to keep it from rotting away. Now we can put things in there and they don't get wet and stuff like that. It's used pretty much for public outreach. And finally, it is now officially an archaeological site too. And we have a datum. We had a student do his master's thesis on it, and we've also hosted descendants from Liberia, Liberian citizens, and it's been a wonderful project. And the fact that we do have archaeology there now and this connection with Liberia and makes it unique, especially to Mississippi history. And I'm going to let Andrew now tell you a little bit about this connection to Liberia that adds a whole new aspect to this plantation.
All right, so thank you, Jessica. The part that I'm going to talk about is really the Mississippi and Liberia section. And so a little bit of brief history on that, on the relationship between Liberia and the United States first. So Liberia was first settled in 1822. So last year was Liberia's 200th anniversary. That's since settlement, not since being an independent country. Providence Island was an early site, and the territory was called the Pepper Coast in the early part of its history, also sometimes called the Grain Coast. It was settled mostly from the United States, and it was America's only colony in Africa, but there's a kind of a caveat to that it was founded and controlled by a private organization, the American Colonization Society. And so it wasn't a public colony in the way that the European colonies were. Capital city was Monrovia, named for President James Monroe, who was both a U.S. president, but also a major actor within the American Colonization Society. And it remained a colony until 1847, when it declared independence and basically became the first African republic. It's often claimed. All right, change slide, please. All right, so this map of Liberia today shows the 15 counties of the country. Like a U.S. state, it's divided into counties, each with a county seat. And to the west, we see Monrovia in capital letters, and that's that's the capital city. It's also the county seat of Montserrado County. If we go down to the east, we see Sinoe. It's the third one to the left from Cote d'Ivoire. And then Greenville's the red dot there. That's where the settlers from Mississippi primarily went in Sinoe County and in broader Liberia. And it was an independent colony at one time called Mississippi and Africa. Next slide. Okay, so a little more about the deeper history before we get to Mississippi. So the origins of the American colonization in Liberia, it goes all the way back to the American Revolution and the formation of Sierra Leone. So after the revolution, the formerly enslaved people who had fought with the Brits basically were mistreated in post-revolutionary America. And as an end result, the British started looking for a place to relocate them. And they first took them to Canada, or some of them, and they weren't terribly pleased with that. And so instead of taking them to Britain or to other places, they created their own colony, basically, Sierra Leone. And after the British slave trade abolition in 1807, Sierra Leone began to grow. And basically, the British Navy would capture ships from private individuals and other European countries, and they would free the enslaved people, and then they would take them to Sierra Leone. The U.S. was watching this, and when slave importation was banned in the USA in 1808, then subsequently there was more interest in creating something like that. That led to the American Colonization Society being founded in 1816. And again, it was a national organization, but it had subsidiary state-level organizations. Sometimes they functioned as chapters, other times they were actually independent. Mississippi's at one point was a subsidiary, at other times it was actually independent for a time because of money through a will. Maryland had one that also functioned independently. The Louisiana State Colonization Society was an entity that sometimes cooperated with the Mississippi one. Then they had them in Virginia, even New York. So it was many states around the country that had these. Like Jessica mentioned, it was an organization with diverse and often shifting ideological commitments. Some were abolitionists, mostly in the Northeast. Some were plantation owners, mostly in the Southeast. And then some also saw it as a means of missionization. And basically they saw the people who had been either free people of color or people who had been enslaved and freed as vectors of missions into Africa. So not all were necessarily anti-slavery, but they all had this interest in creating an American colony of formerly enslaved people and free people of color. Next slide, please. All right, so that gets us to the origins of Mississippi and Africa. The Mississippi State Colonization Society, it was founded in 1831, and primarily in Adams and Jefferson counties, centered around Natchez primarily, and it was many of the wealthiest planters in the state of Mississippi that created this organization. One of those was Isaac Ross, the planter who owned Prospect Hill. He was a significant financial backer. He also served on its governance committee at various points. The first real colonization attempt in Liberia of the Mississippi State Colonization Society, it was in 1838, but they had made prior visits, particularly one in 1835 that was mostly reconnaissance related and trying to get information about logistics. The colony quickly became known as Mississippi and Africa as a colloquial name, and that forms a territory that's part of what is now Sinoe County today. It was centered around a town called Greenville, and this town grew in the 1840s. Greenville was named for James Green, not for Greenville, Mississippi, and James Green was a planter, he was also a judge in the Mississippi Delta. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of ethnographic fieldwork there, I did a couple of months back in 2022 that was focused on historical memory, oral histories, talking primarily with descendants of the settlers, also with adoptees of the settlers, also with indigenous people who either they or their ancestors had interaction with the settlers and their descendants. And so in 2022, I did 1 month in Monrovia and talking with many of the people who had moved there from Sinoe County or who had experience in Sinoe County. And then I also did 1 month in Sinoe County. And that was the first work on this topic that had been done in Sinoe since really back in the 1970s before the coup. Joe Sullivan did work in the 1970s with the Crew people, which is an ethnic group in Sinoe that was looking at their relations with settlement in the past and present. And then there really hadn't been field work in Sinoe on this topic until then. So some of the Americo-Liberian towns were particularly of interest for this. I stayed in Greenville, but also did work in towns like Louisiana and Lexington and Murrysville. Also visited some of the indigenous territories, such as Tubmanville. It's kind of a capital in many ways for the Crew people in eastern Sinoe. And some of the farming areas in Sinoe, such as Grisby Farm, Pratt's Farm, Major Farm, and a few of the others. And basically, these were areas where the Americo-Liberians, that is the descendants of the settlers from Mississippi and other parts of the U.S., that they created agricultural operations and in some cases, basically created exploitative relationships with local indigenous groups. There's some degree of debate on that in Liberia and beyond. I also did 1 month of field work this past summer with Dr. Andrew Wegman at Delta State, who's not here today, but was involved with that field work. He's a historian. And we did follow-up interviews in Monrovia and also talked to some folks that we hadn't met before in Monrovia, talking again about interviews with historical memory, oral history, understanding the way people in the present understand the symbolism of settlement there, the history of settlement, and also in particular indigenous settler relations. which are remembered in many different kinds of ways, both between Americo-Liberians and indigenous people, but often sometimes in complex ways involving adoptees or those with ancestry on both sides. Next slide. All right, so this field work was part of a broader interdisciplinary project that we're working on. The field work in 2022, 2023 set something of a ground level for how people today understand this history and understand its significance in the present, including in relation to the Liberian civil conflicts that really wrecked the country in many ways from 1980 until the early 21st century. And the excavation of Prospect Hill basically starts on the other side of that. It looks at the material culture coming from the earliest period before the people there became Liberian, or many of them became Liberian. Also, archival research is helping to flesh this out in many ways. The material culture tells a story, the people living today tell a story, and then the archives also tell a story. And our goal is to basically triangulate and to interpret between those different narratives. That hopefully will build into an excavation in Liberia in Sinoe County in 2025 that would allow us to map material culture and also to further explore some of these narratives from contemporary populations in Sinoe today. And with that, I'll keep mine a bit short and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Shawn, who can talk more about the excavations at Prospect Hill and also in Liberia. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Jessica. So I'm going to go straight into that, into the archaeology at Prospect Hill pretty quickly. I think it's just so wonderful to be able to get Jessica's experience in the history of Prospect Hill and the people who live there, as well as combining that with Andrew's experience of working with the living descendant communities, because that sets a really great foundation on which to do archaeological work. And it was kind of like this trifecta with Jessica, me, and Andrew coming together, deciding that a public archaeological dig this summer would be pretty advantageous for us to start understanding the history and the material culture of Prospect Hill in ways that haven't been understood before. And so pretty quickly, we made a flyer really fast and set it out, and we got grants from the Mississippi Humanities Council as well as a Mississippi State University Global Seed Grant to help fund this public education and this excavation so that people can come to Prospect Hill to actually get involved and actually excavate and learn how and actually discover the material culture of this site. And so some of the goals were really wanted to work with the descendant communities. And for this public archaeology excavation this past summer, we really wanted to concentrate on the spaces of enslaved, spaces of enslaved, like the enslaved dwelling or slash kitchen house, and to really understand enslaved life at Prospect Hill. And one of the other goals was to try to locate the original foundation of the first big house that burned down, which the second house is built right on top of it. So some of our methods were, of course, to work with our descendant communities in Liberia, something that Andrew's been doing for a few years, work with the public, bring the public in, get the public's perspective, get the public stories, local communities. Then we're going to do working with the public to excavate the area in which the enslaved people lived and worked, and also doing some ground penetrating radar to locate that original foundation of the primary house that was there. So just briefly, what we did is we quickly set up the excavation grid. We set up 18 1-by-1 meter units across this area where we knew that there was some foundation that was being exposed on the surface. As you saw Jessica's map, we thought that we were getting that house to the right that was noted in that was it 1930s or 1940s map, and thinking that this most likely was the enslaved dwelling or kitchen house or both. So we really concentrated our efforts on excavating that area and then exposing those areas as we were finding more and more of the intact foundation. And this right here to the left is just a really awesome LiDAR map, and it's just a really amazing just to see the contours and the shape of this landform and where the house is versus where the cemetery is. And this is where I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is where we excavated about right here, right off before you get down to this really big slope and this erosion area. So what was a wonderful thing is the word spread pretty quickly, and we started getting dozens of people coming each day and wanting to help out with the excavation. So we really didn't have a short of people coming in and wanting to help. I think over the course of the 9 or 10 days that we're out there, we almost had 100 people out there either helping us excavate or visiting and wanting the tours of the site. So it really was a wonderful collaborative and communicative experience. And this is something that we're going to continue to do every year from now on, just so we can learn more about the history of the site. Here's another really wonderful video picture that was on the primary slide, but just kind of showing all the people who were there. It was very hot in the day, but this was early in the morning, so we didn't have to have the pop-up tents. But before long, it got so hot, you'd literally just melt in 5 minutes. So you'd have to have some kind of relief. And thank goodness we have electricity there, so that we can actually we hooked up fans so that people will actually get kind of cool, have some sort of breeze on them, because it was like a sauna. So it was a lot of shade and a lot of Gatorade. And also people come not just excavating. So people were coming in just learning more about the history of the site, wanting to look at the excavation, wanting to look at the material culture that we were finding, but also wanting tours of the house, wanting the tours of the archaeological site, wanting the tours of the cemetery, which is just an absolutely just beautiful part of the site. And that was another really wonderful thing to have the tour, but also look at the excavation as well. So having that mixture of standing structures as well as looking at the archaeology underneath the ground was quite a wonderful experience, not only for me, but hopefully for everyone who was involved with that. So a big thing was locating the original foundation of this possible enslaved dwelling. As you can see here to the left and to the right, we did find that. The public were absolutely amazing. We finished excavating 17 units in 9 days. So can you imagine? We got about 3/4 of this enslaved dwelling excavated, and the features mapped and everything like that, and all of the artifacts collected. And we'll talk about curation here in a second. So some of the wonderful artifact discoveries, I know everyone wants to look at some of the things that we found over the course of those 9 days. And over the course of 9 days, we found over 4,000 artifacts. So we haven't even scratched the surface of this site, and we're already finding thousands and thousands of really, really important material culture that showcases the lives of enslaved individuals at Prospect Hill, which directly connects their lives to a global framework of enslavement. So we're just starting to answer those questions here. One of the coolest things we found was this really beautiful lock plate. We don't know if it's to a door, maybe to a chest, but the fact that these two pieces were still together shows that these artifacts aren't moving very much. So that these artifacts are intact and preserved really, really well. Another thing, something that Susan said is I love to do ceramics, and I'm a ceramic nerd. I will prance like a deer across the way to be able to see any artifact from a nail to a piece of ceramic. And we really found just a wonderful plethora of different types of really cheap utilitarian type of ceramics, as well as more expensive ceramics like the blue transfer printed here, the cheaper stuff, which is my favorite, the hand painted polychrome stuff, and the blue shell edged. And we actually found some porcelain and things like that. So we're getting a mixture of expensive ceramics as well as inexpensive ceramics. So perhaps the expensive ceramics were the ones in the kitchen house that were being used to serve the people in the big house, and the others were being used by the enslaved people that may have lived in that structure. This was one of the coolest things. One of the volunteers was scraping with their trowel and just uncovered this absolutely gorgeous piece of blue shell edge. He was just like screaming out right in the, a lot of the artifacts were coming from the porch area, or right out the porch area, as though they were just throwing them out the window or something. And here's an artifact just in context like that. So it was quite exciting every day to see those things that we were finding. Here's me way too excited about finding our first piece of stoneware. As you can see, our wonderful student volunteer is like, why is he giddy and why did he go up 3 octaves when we found our first stoneware? But anyways, as we find these artifacts, these are perfect moments for me to take those artifacts and show the volunteers like not only diagnostics, but what the function is and what they could have used and what it tells us about the enslaved individuals at the site. So it connects that material culture with the people who live there. And as we work with the living descendant communities, it connects that material culture to that cultural heritage connections today, which makes, I think, archaeology the most powerful. One of the coolest, interesting pieces was this really interesting ferrous metal knife. We actually found a few other pieces of cutlery and flatware, but this one was really just beautiful. And it was in 2 parts, and they were found right next to each other. And you can tell it was almost hand forged. This is definitely not something that the people who lived in the big house would have used, but most likely was made and used by the enslaved people living in that structure. Another important thing that we're finding as we were exposing the foundation were bricks with intact fingerprints on them, and which gives bricks kind of, you know, a breath and a life to them, to kind of really gets to learn about the people who are actually touching them and actually molding these bricks. The small fingerprints here most likely were made by enslaved youth. We do know that that Prospect Hill did have a kiln right on the edge of their boundary, and that might have been used by enslaved youth to make these bricks for the building of the houses and structures there. And we also, today I just received from Jessica another brick from, I don't know if you guys can see that, another brick from Prospect Hill that has little bitty either small dog feet or little kitten feet on the brick. So I'm going to be 3D scanning this guy and then 3D printing it out for use in public archaeology education curriculum. So that's really wonderful. I think one of the most interesting things that we found at Prospect Hill are something that I really didn't think about. And I think a lot of people don't look for these types of objects because they think it's just made out of glass, it's just pieces of glass, and they just kind of toss them in with all the other glass. But we started seeing these pieces of glass that look like they were worked, like actually purposely manipulated by people into particular shapes. At first, we kind of thought they might have been glass gun flints, which has happened before, but it's not. After we kind of thought about it, and Jessica and I went and sent some pictures to some other scholars who is more versed in some of these things. We quickly found out that these aren't gun flints, but they're actually glass scrapers. These unifacial, sometimes bifacial scrapers that were made by enslaved people from broken wine bottles, broken medicine bottles, broken liquor bottles, and they were taking either the bases or the sides and they were sharpening them, as you can see here. And likely what we think about connecting this type of use in Western Africa is that they were using these likely to sharpen and polish wood, but also maybe even to cut hickory for their hickory baskets, or for a lot of other host of different types of things. It might have been something that was kind of like an everyday multi-purpose tool. We just don't know. So this is a really exciting piece to see that just this European-made glass was being transformed within an enslaved context and being used for a different purpose. And that to me is a really important transformation of material culture. And we're going to work with the descendant communities to understand more. And really, I would love to see these types of artifacts being found when we do excavate in Liberia in 2025. So after we were getting done, at the same time we were excavating, we also wanted to do ground penetrating radar at the site. And I'm going to quickly go because I know it's 6:52, but we did ground penetrating radar. That's the ground penetrating radar on the right. It's just it's a very expensive lawnmower. It sends radar waves into the ground. It bounces back up and it tells me what's under the ground without having to excavate. And here is kind of an above view of the big house. The second house, of course, because the first one was burned and this one was built years later. And we wanted to see if we could find the original foundation of the house that was burned. So really the only place we could really do it was in the back of the house. And this was the best place. We did a little bit in the front, But in the back of the house, when we did the ground penetrating radar, the results show that there is an intact foundation, as you can see these black lines right here and here. But also it shows that the foundation of the original house was most likely a much larger than the second house, and which kind of makes sense. They put it on top of the house, but it was a much smaller footprint than the original house. So when we go back next year, we want to maybe open up some excavation units over here to see if in fact this is the foundation, and what else is out there. We also made a lot of new friends. This is Lambert. He always jumped on me every morning, and he stayed with me all day, every day. And everyone was jealous because he was pretty awesome. He was kind of our little mascot for the whole week. So he was kind of a cool guy. He didn't come home with me though. Also, of course, every time we do an excavation, no matter, I could be anywhere in the United States, we're going to find a creepy baby doll. And so I always show the one that we found at Prospect Hill. There's other ones. This one was the least scary, if that's even believable. So this is the one that I'll show you guys. So after the field, what we did is we took all the artifacts and actually curated them, analyzed them, all 4,000+ artifacts. And now they're ready to be exhibited, to be studied, and to then be connected to other places in the world, like the Liberian settlements. I just want to quickly say that we had a lot of media coverage. This grew exponentially really fast. Thank goodness. I know that Andrew did a lot of back work in here in terms of getting the word out to all these different media areas, and so if you guys want to check those out, here are the links to those as well. And what's next? Like Andrew said, we want to get a National Geographic research grant to fund travel and excavation in Greenville in Sinoe County, where the Liberian community first settled when they were freed from the Prospect Hill, and then working with the descendant communities locally there, which will be really, really important. Many thanks to the Archaeological Conservancy, the Mississippi University, Troy University, MSU Global Seed Grant, Mississippi Humanities Council, descendant communities, volunteers, and visitors. And I think we are ready. Thank you guys so much for joining in, and hopefully we have a few minutes for questions.
I think all three of you need to take a breath. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Because of my bobble with our getting on Facebook Live, we're going to extend by a few minutes. I hope you all can stick with us. But participants, if you need to leave us, we understand. We will get all these posted. And Shawn, would you send me the list of links that you have so that I can post those for people so that they're clickable? So thank you very much to my partner in crime. Nikki has been helping me gather questions. The first one that we want to pose to you all, and I'm not sure who this goes to. We had a question early on that asked how, or maybe why, did the area of Liberia allow the movement of these ex-slaves?
Well, it wasn't a independent country at the time. There were groups living there, and there were various different forms of negotiations and coercions and things that basically were involved in them setting it up. There were different colonies established. So the one in Providence Island was one, which later, basically, it kind of is the early settlement that later on becomes Monrovia, more or less. The one in Sinoe is separate. The one in Maryland had its own separate society, which actually maintained independence longer than any of the others. And they slowly became amalgamated into the country of Liberia, institutionally speaking, not culturally or et cetera, but basically they became part of the country in piecemeal fashion. But yeah, it was a complicated, murky, and sometimes very unjust process that happened. And sometimes it was more cooperative, other times it was more coercive. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, the second question, did the original inhabitants of the region welcome these new settlers onto their homeland?
Again, it depends on which particular area, right? So, I mean, there had been trade along those coasts for long prior to that. And so they carved out niches, is basically the way I would put it.
So the third question that I have, I think it might go over to Jessica a little bit too. They're asking, did many of the free people keep the Ross name after they were freed?
There are still some Ross family members or descendants of enslaved people who have the last name Ross. But there are also, I have managed to do some genealogy of some of those who did stay in the area, and they have different last names. The one in particular that I traced from the 1830s through the 1870s, his name was Orange Lake. And of course, that's an unusual name. So I was able to trace him. He did not go to Liberia because his parents died and he was under 21. So he was not given the choice, which, you know, it's not that the will wasn't, you know, everybody didn't exactly have a choice. But I believe then there were enslaved descendants in Liberia with the last name of Ross as well. There were some named with the last name of Belton, which is another, the Beltons were a family who were close to the Ross family. So, you know, they mixed as well, and there are Beltons that wrote back from Liberia. A lot of the people who went to Liberia did write letters back to the family at Prospect Hill, to the Wade family. And, you know, it asked, say, you know, tell the others when they come to bring seed. And of course, they also wanted to know where the supplies they were supposed to get from the will when they were going to arrive. And of course, the estate was bankrupt by then. They never got them. But there was an exchange of letters back until the Civil War, and that pretty much ended it.
I should probably mention in the Liberian side that some of the people with last names associated with Mississippi are adoptees, or their ancestors were adoptees. So it's not always lineal. And in some cases, it's hard to trace where their names were. So there are several sets of Rosses. And so the Rosses in Sinoe, for example, it's not entirely clear where their ancestors were coming from or whether they were at some point adopted by settlers of descendants of the settlers. So it's kind of murky today as to exactly how to draw the lines and how the relations go. There's several sets of Rosses across Liberia.
Which this emphasizes the importance of sharing family papers and, you know, transcribing wills, letters, accounts, things like that. A lot of this stuff is only available in, you know, in wills and family papers. And that makes it very difficult for descendants of enslaved people to do genealogy. And that's another thing where I'm trying to stress with Prospect Hill is for all people connected with Prospect Hill Plantation to share their knowledge and share their family stories, especially the white part of the family who has all the written documents. It's important that that's out there and shared.
Absolutely. How were the remains of Prospect Hill originally found? Jessica, I know you shared the photo of the survey that was done, you said in the 20s or 30s?
Let's see. The family was living in the house that was built in 1854, the second house. The Wade family lived in it through I think the late 1970s. And then they sold it to a man, and then this gentleman sold it to a man that we bought it from. So it hasn't had many owners since, but it has not been in very good shape, but it has been inhabited, you know, since it was built.
So it did never get to a point where it was lost and then found again.
Well, it's been very close, and it's kind of close now. I mean, you know, you wouldn't live in it now. A peacock lived in, a previous owner left, and a peacock lived in it for 7 years, so, which is why I have a peacock on the shelf behind me. We had a peacock, the Conservancy had a peacock there for the first 7 years that we owned it. And but it's still not, I mean, it doesn't have indoor plumbing and the windows are out. We just have a roof on it to keep the rain from doing any more damage. And we will try to do more repairs to it so it's safe and stable to do outreach with.
Great. Do we know where the Prospect Hill slaves originated? We're talking, I think they're referring to the original African locations. Has there been any work to determine that?
I'm sorry. I don't know where these came from. South Carolina. So before that, I don't know.
They mean in terms of in Africa, or they mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. The best guess, and at this point, it's really very little more than a guess, is possibly from the Senegambia area, but that's not certain. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the records of slave ships, for example, in order to really narrow that down and to specify it for that particular site and those particular families. But in talking with historians about it, Senegambia is probably the closest guess that we have right now, although it may end up being incorrect.
Okay, thank you. Are there any traces of Paleo-Indian remains on the plantation or any contact remains?
We didn't find any evidence of pre-European contact stuff, but I know that Jessica has found projectile points, or at least one, on the site. So what happens usually, the best place to build a either if it's a plantation home or a regular or another type of structure, it's usually a good place where pre-European contact individuals also set up camp. And so most likely there is a Native American component there as well.
Yeah, I have found, there have been a few archaic period points found out there, and one what we would call a nutting stone. But as far as during the excavations, we've not found any features or nothing in situ.
Do you have any idea where the wells and privies were from eras when the house was occupied?
Yeah, I mean actually, do we actually know exactly where the privy is? We have an idea of like where the privy that might be a privy, but we don't know yet. That might be that's going to be a future endeavor and future.
Thought I was digging on it at one point. I might, if that wasn't confirmed.
Yeah, so there's a lot of foundations out there of smaller buildings that we just don't know, and those are the things that we're going to discover in the near future. But all the other the cisterns are we can see where all those are for sure. Those are all really good shape.
Instead of wells, when they collected rainwater and then filled the cisterns from a pipe that went to the cistern from the bottom. So, and those are very visible. There's several out there.
Wells don't do a good job in Southwest Mississippi.
So another related question was, what about the slave quarters? Do you know where they were?
Well, we think that we're digging on, at least excavating on the structure where like the kitchen house maybe where like some enslaved individuals were living. I'm Jessica. There were clearly were other enslaved dwellings. But most likely, I'm going to speak for Jessica, they may not be on that 25 acres of land that is currently owned by the Archaeological Conservancy.
Yeah, there's an adjacent landowner who has the foundation of tenant houses on his property, and looking at the old aerial photographs, I think that's sort of the evolution of farming there. You have, and I've actually walked out there in the woods and looked in the remains of these tenant houses where there's like 10 and 1920s washing machines and things like that. And there's also salt glazed pottery there, things like from the early to mid 1800s, which of course could have been just still used in the 1920s, but also older brick. And so I believe it's on some land that's adjacent, that's sort of right behind the house. Is that we're actually an area that you would call the quarters for people who worked out in the fields on the plantation. And so that obviously that's a priority for me as far as land acquisition, is to get that.
All right, thank you, Jessica.
Yeah. And someone had mentioned asked about the slave cemetery. I did see that too, and we have not found that. I have one spot that I would like to look at some point with ground penetrating radar, but yeah, somewhere out there are a lot of graves of enslaved people. We don't know where yet, though.
Something else that I might mention briefly on that's not directly but tangentially related. In Greenville, it's very difficult to find the graves of the early settlers. There's a large cemetery area in one part of Greenville, but the earliest, just from walking around and looking at tombstones, the earliest dates are from about the 1880s. And so as far as where the earliest people are buried, right now it's kind of a mystery.
So we're getting real close to 6:10. I think one more question, and then we'll take the rest of the questions, and I'll get answers for you all, and I will be sending that out to you with an email tomorrow with the link to the YouTube channel where you'll find this as well as all of our other recorded sessions too. So I know some of you have been asking, how do I get this later on? So for the last question, are you trying to get DNA from any of the Prospect Hill artifacts and compare with descendants? Is that something that's in the works or in the vision?
No, only for the fact that the quick DNA is probably, if there was DNA on these artifacts, most likely it would be not there anymore, completely gone due to the acidic soils that these artifacts ran for almost 200 years. So that probably, so no on that one. Now there are special circumstances. My field school at Concord Quarters, which is almost a contemporary plantation site, we found a mourning locket that most likely was owned by an enslaved woman, and it looks like there most likely is intact hair in that mourning locket. Now that could potentially be used for DNA and to maybe even find ancestry, connecting that mourning locket to the person, to the descendant communities living today. But usually archaeologists, we don't do DNA analysis in very special circumstances.
All right. I want to take a moment and thank all three of you. This was absolutely amazing. You've had a very active back end. We've been answering questions in both formats. We've got a list of things that we'll send to you. Thank you for taking your time with us tonight. Jessica, thank you for arranging for this to happen.
Sure. Everybody knows I love Prospect Hill. Could go on and on about Prospect Hill. And Prospect Hill has a Facebook page also, its own Facebook page. So you can kind of keep up with what's going on out there as well. It's Prospect Hill Plantation on Facebook.
So I'll make sure to send that out also. And then Shawn, you'll send me all the links.
Yes. Yeah.
So everybody, thank you for joining us. We will be also doing another lecture in October, on October 26th. We're going to be hearing from Ken Zoll, who is the professor or the director emeritus from the Verde Valley Archaeological Center. So that should be an interesting talk also. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks all.